November 12th, 1942, Richmond, California. The sun had just begun to burn the morning mist off San Francisco Bay when a vessel unlike any other stood poised at the edge of the Permanente Metals shipyard. She was 441 feet long, her steel hull gleaming faintly beneath the pale sky, her weight measured in the language of industry, 90,000 pounds of purpose. Behind her gates, the waters waited. In just a few moments, she would slide free into the bay. Her name, SS Robert E. Peary. Her achievement, something no nation had ever done before. This Liberty ship had been built from keel to completion in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. Before this moment, the proudest shipyards in America, Bath, Newport News, Camden, took half a year, sometimes more, to craft a vessel of that scale. Since the days of sail and timber, master shipwrights had built ships as artisans, one rivet, one plank, one generation at a time. But here, on the western edge of the continent, something had shifted. 1,000 workers stepped back from their work, faces streaked with soot and pride, their gloves still warm from the welding torches. They were not shipbuilders by blood or birth. They were secretaries, farmers, housewives, miners, students, Americans who, just weeks earlier, had never set foot inside a shipyard. Yet together, they had forged steel into history. A crowd had gathered along the pier, naval officers in pressed uniforms, journalists with cameras poised, representatives from rival shipyards who came half out of curiosity, half out of disbelief. They expected spectacle. They found revelation. What they witnessed that morning was not just the launching of a ship, but the birth of a revolution, the industrial kind, silent and relentless, that would outlast every battle fought on land or sea. The mathematics of Allied victory, it turned out, were not being written in the smoke of artillery, but in the ledgers of production. This moment had been set in motion nearly 2 years earlier, on December 27, 1940, when Henry J. Kaiser, a man who had never built a ship in his life, signed his first contract with the United States Maritime Commission. He was 58 years old, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who had spent his career not at sea, but on land, carving rivers into dams and pouring concrete into mountains. He had built the great arteries of the American West, Hoover, Bonneville, Grand Coulee. But ships were a different beast. Still, Kaiser promised to deliver 30 cargo vessels for Britain within 2 years, at a time when the Atlantic itself was becoming a graveyard for Allied tonnage. Traditional shipbuilders laughed. The old guard at Todd Bath Iron Works in Maine, whose family names had been etched into the history of American maritime craft, considered him an opportunist, a landman dabbling in oceans. They agreed to partner with him only out of obligation, convinced they could correct his ignorance with their expertise. But what they couldn't see was that Kaiser's ignorance, his freedom from tradition, would become his weapon. Among those watching from a distance was William Francis Gibbs, perhaps the greatest naval architect of his generation. Gibbs had designed more ships than Kaiser had ever seen, including the very blueprints for the Liberty-class cargo vessels, drawn from British prototypes. He was a man of precision, a perfectionist, who saw ships as mathematical symphonies. But Kaiser saw something else. Where Gibbs saw design, Kaiser saw process. And it was process, not artistry, that would change the war. In early 1941, in the planning offices of Todd Shipyards in New York, Kaiser and his team studied the traditional methods of ship construction. It didn't take long for the realization to strike. If they followed the old ways, they would fail. The world no longer had the luxury of time. Kaiser's chief engineer, Clay Bedford, had just returned from Detroit, where he had toured a Ford Motor Company assembly line. He had watched automobile chassis glide down steel tracks while workers installed parts at fixed stations, each movement practiced to perfection. When Bedford came back to California, he was electrified. "Why?" he asked. Can't we build ships the same way? The old builders scoffed. To them, a ship was an organism, something grown, not assembled. But Kaiser listened, and then he made a decision that sent shockwaves through the industry. He would eliminate riveting entirely. For generations, riveting had been the heartbeat of shipbuilding. Teams of men, muscles glistening under firelight, hurled red-hot pins through overlapping plates of steel, sealing them tight with hammer and precision. A good crew could drive 100 rivets a day. Each Liberty ship would need nearly 1 million. It was a process measured in sweat, noise, and time. 3 things Kaiser could no longer afford. Instead, he proposed something unthinkable: electric arc welding. He had used it building pipelines through deserts and mountains, joining miles of steel with arcs of blue fire. Welding, he said, would replace the hammer's blow with precision heat, sealing seams faster, lighter, stronger. The establishment was horrified. Vice Admiral Emory Land, head of the U.S. Maritime Commission, wrote privately of his doubts. Welding, he noted, has never been proven reliable for hulls of this size. The British Navy forbids it outright. Kaiser is asking us to gamble the Atlantic lifeline on an untested technique. But necessity, as always in war, left no room for hesitation. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic like wolves, tearing through Allied convoys. In 1941 alone, over 3.6 million tons of shipping vanished beneath the waves. Britain was starving. Traditional shipyards required 230 days to deliver a single vessel. At that rate, the Allies were losing the Battle of the Atlantic before it had even begun. So, the contract was approved, not out of faith, but desperation. And from the mudflats of Richmond, California, the impossible began to rise. Through 1941, Kaiser's crews, men and women who had poured concrete for dams, not rivets into hulls, built an entirely new kind of shipyard. It looked nothing like the grand old ports of the East Coast. There were no vast gantry cranes or dry dock cathedrals echoing with rivet hammers. Instead, Richmond was open, modular, laid out like an automobile assembly line under the sky. Prefabrication zones surrounded 7 parallel building ways. Railroad tracks threaded between them, moving sections of steel as if they were car parts. Towering cranes capable of lifting 150-ton sections stood every 100 feet, gleaming against the bay light, like industrial giants waiting for purpose. When John Riley, chief naval architect at Bethlehem Steel, and a man with 30 years of shipyard tradition behind him, inspected the Richmond Yard in May 1941, he could scarcely believe what he saw. His confidential report, unearthed decades later, was filled with both criticism and reluctant respect. Kaiser has violated every principle I've ever learned, he wrote. His prefabrication areas are excessive. His cranes are oversized. His ways are too short. Yet, the facility is perfectly suited for what he claims, the rapid assembly of prefabricated ships. That word, rapid, was the beginning of everything. Then came the workers, not from the docks of New York or the shipwright guilds of Maine, but from the plains, the towns, the offices of ordinary America. Kaiser advertised across the nation, offering wages 20% higher than standard industry rates, promising training for anyone willing to work. And they came, by train, by bus, by hope. Families seeking a living, a purpose, and perhaps a small part in the colossal struggle overseas. By August 1941, the Richmond yards buzzed with activity. Instructors, many barely a step ahead of their own students, taught newcomers to weld, fit, and align steel. Tasks that once required years of apprenticeship were divided, simplified, redefined. Instead of mastering the entire craft, each worker learned one precise operation: vertical seams, horizontal plates, curved joints, and repeated it until it became second nature. Within 2 weeks, they could do what once took years to teach. By October, Kaiser employed over 10,000 men and women. Fewer than 200 had ever seen a ship built before. But that didn't matter. The rhythm of industry had replaced the rhythm of tradition. Sparks flew like stars at dusk. The clang of steel became the anthem of a nation at work. And then, the numbers began to change. The first Liberty ship took 197 days to complete. The second, 169. The fifth, 128. The 10th, 97. By the spring of 1942, Richmond was launching ships in an average of 70 days. What had once taken seasoned shipwrights nearly a year was now done in 2 months by people who, a year earlier, hadn't known the bow from the stern. Traditional shipyards watched in silence, part disbelief, part alarm. Their apprenticeships, their craft, their legacy, all being rewritten by mass production. And the proof was undeniable. Kaiser's revolution had replaced sequential labor with parallel creation. While one crew welded a bow in one corner of the yard, another shaped the stern. Deckhouses, bulkheads, and engine rooms rose simultaneously, ready to be joined. When the sections were complete, cranes swung them into place, giant mechanical arms piecing together a leviathan. By the time the SS Robert E. Peary slid into San Francisco Bay that November morning, America had discovered something extraordinary, that ingenuity, multiplied by will, could bend time itself. For the first time, a ship was no longer a monument to patience, but a triumph of process, a testament to what happens when necessity meets imagination. As the Liberty ship drifted into the water, a cheer rose from the crowd. Cameras clicked, flags waved, but amid the celebration, a quiet truth lingered. This wasn't just about ships. It was about speed, adaptability, and the spirit of a nation that had learned to turn blueprints into weapons faster than its enemies could destroy them. In that moment, with sunlight glinting off her welded seams and the voices of 1,000 workers echoing across the bay, America's industrial heart began to beat in rhythm with war itself. And far beyond the Pacific horizon, the Axis powers would soon hear that rhythm. Steady, tireless, unstoppable, like the pulse of an entire people who had learned that victory could be welded, one spark at a time. Albert Wooding still remembered the moment the old ways gave way to something entirely new. In a quiet interview with Fortune magazine in 1943, the production supervisor of Richmond Yard No. 2 leaned back in his chair, the hum of the shipyard echoing faintly behind him. In traditional shipbuilding, he explained, his voice patient, almost weary, you cannot install the engine until the engine room is built, and you cannot build the engine room until the hull is complete. Everything happens in sequence, one step chained to the last. He paused, a small smile forming. Kaiser's approach breaks that chain. He lets everything happen at once. While one crew welds hull plates, another assembles the engine in a separate hull. When both are ready, we drop the completed engine into the completed engine room and weld it in place. What used to take weeks now takes hours. It sounded like alchemy to those raised in the gospel of maritime craft, but the numbers didn't lie. The mathematics of parallel production, as they came to call it, were astonishing. A traditional shipyard might assign 50 men to install an engine over 3 exhausting weeks, their bodies hunched inside, a half-built hull working by lamplight in the confined heat of steel walls. But at Kaiser's yards, 200 workers assembled that same engine and its entire mounting structure out in the open, under skylight and fresh air, finishing the job in 5 days. Then, a crane, massive, silent as a heron, lifted the entire structure and lowered it precisely into place. 8 hours later, the ship had an engine. What once took nearly a month could now be done in less than half a shift. To the old guard, this wasn't just innovation, it was heresy. For centuries, ships had been born from carefully drafted plans, every bolt and beam mapped in advance by naval architects. But Kaiser, He used simplified drawings, broad dimensions, key measurements, and faith in the workers' intuition. To traditional builders, this was chaos. To Kaiser, it was freedom. Vice Admiral Howard Vickery of the U.S. Maritime Commission, a lifelong sailor with salt in his blood, fought against it at first. His reports from early 1942 were firm, almost indignant. "Ships are not automobiles," he wrote. "Maritime construction requires precision, not improvisation." But war has a way of bending certainty. By March, the results spoke louder than his doubts. Kaiser's shipyards were outproducing traditional builders by 40%. By June, the gap had grown to 70. "I learned," Vickery admitted later, "that perfection is the enemy of sufficient." The Liberty ships weren't beautiful. Their lines were blunt, their welds unpolished. But they floated, they sailed, they delivered. And that, Vickery realized, was enough. Through the spring and summer of 1942, the energy of competition began to ripple across the Pacific coast. Henry Kaiser had built not one shipyard, but 7, each a living organism of fire, steel, and sweat. From Richmond, California, to Portland, Oregon, to Vancouver, Washington, the rhythm of production beat like a war drum. His son, Edgar Kaiser, oversaw the Pacific Northwest yards with the same fierce focus that had driven his father west decades earlier. In California, Clay Bedford, the quiet, brilliant engineer, commanded Richmond Yard No. 2, the experimental heart of Kaiser's empire. The two men, Edgar and Bedford, turned efficiency into rivalry. It began informally, a contest of pride. But soon the newspapers caught wind of it. Headlines began printing shipbuilding times like sports scores. Portland 12 days, Richmond 11. Can Oregon beat California? Reporters swarmed the yards, their flashbulbs turning welders into accidental heroes. Crowds gathered at the fences to watch hulls take shape, to see the miracle with their own eyes. The race reached fever pitch in September 1942, when Oregon Shipbuilding launched the SS Joseph N. Teal in just 10 days, a record that stunned even Kaiser himself. The feat made headlines across the nation. It was said that some workers in Portland refused to go home until the ship touched water. For a moment, it seemed speed itself had become a weapon, but not everyone was amused. Vice Admiral Vickery, now converted but cautious, ordered an end to the public competition. "These are not stunts," he warned. "They are ships for war." The races ceased, but the mindset remained. Workers across every Kaiser yard had glimpsed the possible. They now believed that extraordinary speed was not a miracle, but a standard. And so, in November 1942, that belief was put to the ultimate test. During an inspection visit to Richmond, Vice Admiral Emory Land, the Maritime Commission's chairman, made an offhand remark to a group of journalists. The admiral, grizzled, pragmatic, praised the improvements in Liberty ship construction, but added that, compared to mass production in other industries, the shipyard still lagged behind. The comment, half jest and half truth, reached Clay Bedford's ears, and Bedford, ever the quiet competitor, took it as a challenge. That night, he walked the length of the building ways under the cold glow of arc lamps, the silhouettes of cranes looming against the fog. He turned to his foreman and said, almost calmly, "We'll do it. We'll build a Liberty ship in less than 10 days. Land, skeptical but intrigued, gave cautious approval. The attempt must not disrupt normal production. Bedford nodded. The 47th hull at Yard No. 2 would be the one. Its name had already been chosen, SS Robert E. Peary, after the Arctic explorer who had chased the edge of the world. At 1 minute past midnight on Sunday, November 8, 1942, a whistle sounded across Richmond. Over 1,000 men and women stepped into motion, their shifts planned with the precision of an orchestra. Under arc lights, sparks ignited the darkness. The project began. Every piece of the ship had been prefabricated in advance, the culmination of every lesson Kaiser's empire had learned. The bow, built from more than 50 individual steel plates, already held its anchor gear, chain lockers, and forward crew quarters. The stern was complete with steering gear, propeller shaft, and aft living spaces. 4 enormous cargo holds waited on rail cars, each a massive block of steel ready to be lifted into place. Even the engine, a 140-ton triple expansion steam unit built by Joshua Hendy Ironworks in Sunnyvale, had been assembled, tested, and mounted on its foundation before it ever saw the shipyard. The process that followed looked less like construction and more like choreography. The sections were swung into place one after another, the cranes gliding through the fog like patient giants. Sparks cascaded down the hulls in showers of gold. By the 4th day, the Peary's hull was complete. Seams welded, cargo holds secured, steering gear mounted. And on the afternoon of Thursday, November 12th, at 3:30 p.m., just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes after that first whistle, the SS Robert E. Peary slid down the Chent, greased rails, and met the bay. The cheers that followed rolled like thunder across the water. 3 days later, she was delivered for service, 7 days, 14 hours, and 32 minutes from keel to completion. Never before in the history of shipbuilding had such a thing been done. The audience that day was a mixture of skeptics and converts. Maritime officials in polished shoes stood beside workers in coveralls. Military officers watched alongside rival shipyard owners. Some had come expecting a hollow demonstration, an unfinished shell rushed into publicity, but what they saw silenced them. The ship floated, fully operational, engines tested, hull sound. It was not a stunt, it was proof. Vice Admiral Land, eyes narrowed against the glare of the water, stepped to a makeshift podium. The newsreel cameras rolled. His voice, calm and measured, carried through the cold November air. 6 months ago, he said, I would have called this impossible. Traditional wisdom, built over 3,000 years, says you cannot build a proper ship in 5 days. Henry Kaiser has made that wisdom obsolete. He paused. From this day, every contracted yard in the United States will adopt these methods. That declaration echoed across the industry like a signal flare. Within weeks, engineers from the most established shipyards, New York, Camden, Bath, were sent west to study the Kaiser methods they had once mocked. In December 1942, the president of New York Shipbuilding Corporation, one of the oldest and proudest firms in America, visited Richmond himself. His confidential report to the board, now preserved in archives, read with startling humility. Kaiser has achieved what our industry deemed impossible by refusing to accept our limitations, he wrote. He treated shipbuilding as a manufacturing problem, not a craft tradition. He simplified where we sought perfection. He standardized where we customized. He trained thousands of unskilled hands where we cultivated a few masters. And the result, ships built in 1/10 the time, at 2/3 the cost. We must either adopt his ways or vanish into history. By then, the die was cast. America's industrial heart had learned to beat faster. The hum of Richmond, the clatter of Portland, the sparks over the bay, these sounds had become the pulse of a new kind of warfare. One fought not by soldiers, but by builders. And somewhere in that thunder of engines and cranes, you could almost hear it, the soft, metallic rhythm of progress, the sound of a nation learning how to outbuild its own past. By the dawn of 1943, Henry Kaiser's vision had not merely reshaped American industry, it had redrawn the entire map of maritime production. From the Atlantic to the Pacific, across 18 roaring shipyards, sparks filled the night skies as Liberty ships rose from the ground like iron colossi. The old rhythms of shipbuilding, once measured in months of slow assembly and hand-forged precision, were replaced by a new cadence, fast, methodical, relentless. The time from keeling to launch, once counted in 230 long days, now averaged just 42. America was launching 3 Liberty ships every single day, more steel afloat than German U-boats could ever send to the bottom. It was not simply an industrial miracle, it was the sound of a nation retooling itself for survival. But perhaps the most profound disruption wasn't in the machinery, it was in the people. The men and women who built these ships looked nothing like the guild-trained craftsmen who had once ruled the docks. They were farmers, miners, teachers, clerks, mechanics, housewives who had never held a torch before the war. Tens of thousands of them trained in weeks, not years. In their hands, Kaiser found the heartbeat of a new America, one that believed skill could be learned, discipline could be shared, and the right leadership could make ordinary citizens extraordinary. By 1944, at the height of production, Kaiser's 7 shipyards employed nearly 200,000 workers. 40,000 of them were women, rosies in coveralls and welding masks, hair tucked under bandanas, eyes lit by the glow of molten metal. At Richmond alone, women made up more than a quarter of the production force. And farther north, across Oregon and Washington, 31,000 women stood side by side with men, shaping the war's outcome one seam at a time. African-American workers, too, entered shipyards in unprecedented numbers, tens of thousands, trained for skilled labor in welding, crane operation, and foreman duties. For many, it was the first time the color line had blurred under the same roof of work. Richmond's shipyards became an unlikely frontier of social change, still imperfect, but undeniably different. Within the fiery crucibles of industry, Kaiser had built something larger than ships. He had built opportunity. The old masters of maritime craft, those who once insisted that steel hulls could only be shaped by hereditary skill, were left confronting a new truth. Complex industrial work could be learned, taught, and multiplied. Tradition gave way to systems. The world of shipwrights had been democratized. Christmas of 1943 brought that truth to life in a way no production statistic could express. While other shipyards dimmed their lights for the holiday, Kaiser's kept burning. But there was no cruelty in it, no forced labor through sacred hours. Instead, the yards themselves became celebrations of shared purpose. Management served Christmas dinners inside the cafeterias. Turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, and pies, everything free for the men and women on shift. Local churches sent choirs to wander the halls, their carols rising through the clang of distant steel. The Richmond Municipal Band performed under a makeshift banner that read simply, "For those who keep the ships moving." And Henry Kaiser himself walked among them, no speech, no grandstanding, just handshakes, smiles, and a few words of gratitude. In that moment, the war felt distant. The cold Pacific wind carried not the scent of industry, but of belonging. By mid-1944, Kaiser's 7 yards had built more than 800 Liberty ships, but the scale of his influence extended far beyond his own fences. Across the United States, 18 shipyards were now using his prefabrication and welding methods. Together, they produced 2,400 vessels by the end of that year. And as the Liberty design reached its limits, the Victory ships arrived, a sleeker, faster generation built on the same principles, carrying the same DNA of mass efficiency. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States launched over 5,500 merchant ships, 53 million tons of steel that turned the tide of a global conflict. The numbers were staggering, and even now they seem impossible. Commander Joseph Kenworthy of the Royal Navy, stationed with the British Admiralty delegation in Washington, watched the miracle unfold with both admiration and unease. His official reports, unsealed decades later, captured it with restrained awe. The United States is building merchant shipping at a rate that exceeds the combined capacity of the rest of the world. Kaiser alone produces more tonnage monthly than the entire British shipbuilding industry. The methods are crude by Admiralty standards, the ships inelegant, but they float, they carry cargo, and there are thousands of them. That single phrase, adequate multiplied by thousands, defeats perfection multiplied by dozens, summed up the revolution. For centuries, Britain had prided itself on craftsmanship, the slow elegance of precision. But in war, beauty became a luxury and speed became salvation. America had found its rhythm. When the war ended, traditional analysts predicted collapse. They saw the shipyards as temporary fortresses, useful in crisis, destined for decay in peace. And in part, they were right. By late 1945, Liberty production ceased. The workers who had built the fleet of freedom began to drift away. From 200,000, Kaiser's workforce shrank to fewer than 20,000. The once roaring Richmond yards, which had glowed like cities of light, fell silent by spring 1946. Cranes stood frozen in place, their hooks swaying gently in the bay wind. But the knowledge remained. The prefabrication systems, the modular assembly, the parallel production, these did not die when the whistle stopped. They became the bones of modern shipbuilding. When Japan and South Korea began to rebuild their shattered industries in the 1950s and 60s, they studied the Liberty program with near religious devotion. From Nagasaki to Ulsan, the lessons of Richmond were reborn. Shipyards rose again on distant shores, drawing directly from Kaiser's blueprint, yards that would one day dominate world production for half a century. Professor John Bunker, a maritime historian at the State University of New York, wrote decades later, Kaiser entered shipbuilding as an outsider, unbound by tradition, unwilling to be constrained by old rules. In just 36 months, he built more ships than America had managed in the previous 100 years. But his true legacy was not in the numbers. It was in the transformation of how ships would forever be built. The modular construction, the prefabricated sections, the welded seams that once scandalized the old shipwrights, all of it became standard. Today, every modern vessel, from Korean container ships to Japanese oil tankers to European cruise liners, follows the same philosophy. The echo of Richmond's forges still lingers in every dock where sections of steel meet like puzzle pieces. The statistics of the Liberty program tell the story in cold clarity. Between 1941 and 1945, 18 American shipyards built 2,010 Liberty ships, an average of nearly 2 ships per day at the program's peak. Kaiser's 7 yards alone produced 1,590 of them, over a quarter of all U.S. wartime merchant tonnage. Construction time, once a year-long endeavor, fell to 42 days on average. And then there was the record. The Robert E. Peary, born in 4 days and 15 hours, a miracle in steel. Labor efficiency soared. The first Liberty ships had devoured 1.1 million man-hours each. By 1943, that figure had fallen to less than half, around 486,000 hours. Richmond yards. 2 and 3, running day and night on 3 continuous shifts, reached an almost impossible low, just 350,000 hours per ship. Even the costs told a story of refinement. The first Liberty ships had cost nearly $2 million apiece. By 1943, despite rising wages and material prices, the average cost was lower, about $1.8 million, proof that experience, like good steel, hardens under pressure. Each Liberty ship displaced 14,245 tons and could carry 10,800 tons of cargo. That meant 2,840 jeeps, or 440 tanks, or 230 million rounds of ammunition per voyage. Beneath their decks beat the heart of a simple triple expansion steam engine, not glamorous, but sturdy, forgiving, easy to maintain. They cruised at 11 knots, not fast, not graceful, but fast enough to reach their convoys and steady enough to come home. And that, perhaps, was the lesson of Henry Kaiser's revolution. These ships were not built to impress. They were built to endure. In their welded seams lived a quiet philosophy that would carry modern industry into the future. That reliability, not refinement, wins wars. By the end of the war, as the last Liberty ships slipped out into the Pacific mist, the air in Richmond felt different. The hammers had quieted, but the echoes stayed. The glow of the furnaces lingered on the walls long after they cooled. The workers, men and women who had once come from farms and offices, left with the memory of having done something that mattered. And somewhere in the silence of that vast, empty yard, the wind, off the bay, whispered against the rusting cranes, like the breath of a sleeping giant that had already changed the world. By 1943, the shipyards of Richmond, Portland, and Vancouver had become more than factories. They were living testaments to what organized human effort could achieve under pressure. Within their walls, tens of thousands of workers, men and women who had never seen a ship before the war, labored side by side, sparks dancing around them like fireflies against the steel night. Training that once took years was now condensed into weeks. In Kaiser's system, the essence of expertise was not time, it was purpose. Workers didn't need to master the whole craft. They needed to perfect their part in the vast, coordinated rhythm of production. Kaiser's schools taught this new language of precision. A ship fitter or crane operator might spend 4 to 6 weeks in training before joining the line. Spot welders, the lifeblood of the Liberty program, could become productive in just 10 days. In an age when apprenticeships in shipbuilding traditionally lasted 4 years before earning basic credentials and a decade to achieve mastery, this seemed impossible. Yet Kaiser's innovation wasn't in cutting corners. It was in dividing complexity into its smallest, most teachable parts. Traditional builders sought artisans. Kaiser sought specialists, and he found them by the thousands. Every motion was part of an enormous choreography. Where once a master builder would shape an entire hull, now hundreds of hands worked in unison, each perfecting a single action repeated hundreds of times a day. The rhythm of the Liberty shipyards was almost musical, a symphony of arc welders, grinders, cranes, and rolling steel echoing across the bay. It was loud, relentless, but strangely graceful. Skeptics doubted that such speed and simplification could produce vessels worthy of the sea. They imagined welded hulls tearing apart in the North Atlantic, ships folding under stress. Yet history would prove them wrong. Of the 2,710 Liberty ships built, only about 200 were lost to enemy action, a loss rate of just 7.4%. In the brutal arithmetic of war, that number was not just acceptable, it was remarkable. Some failures did occur, of course. A handful of ships suffered brittle fractures that split their steel frames, 3 breaking clean in half. But even these rare incidents, just 0.11% of the fleet, became lessons that improved metallurgy and welding standards across the industry. By 1944, those problems had been solved entirely. The ships that were once dismissed as fragile Kaiser coffins proved not only seaworthy, but enduring. They were meant to last 5 years. Many lasted a lifetime. The SS John W. Brown, built in 1942, still floats today as a museum ship in Baltimore, more than 8 decades later. The Jeremiah O'Brien, also from 1942, steamed across the Atlantic in 1994 to commemorate the 50th anniversary of D-Day, engines still faithful after half a century. In Greece, the Hellas Liberty remains docked as a museum, silent yet proud, her riveted spirit preserved in paint and salt air. Even after the war, hundreds of Liberty ships found second lives. Of the 2,810 that survived, more than 800 remained in commercial service into the 1960s. Some sailed into the 1970s under foreign flags, carrying cargo instead of conflict. The last of them, the Albert M. Bow, delivered in 1945, was sold and converted in 1964 into the Star of Kodiak, a floating fish cannery in Alaska. She still stands there today, landlocked but alive, as the headquarters of Trident Seafoods. The ship that once crossed oceans now feeds them, a quiet poetry only time could write. The Liberty program did more than deliver ships. It transformed the American industrial landscape. The steel demands alone reshaped the nation's economy. Kaiser built his own Fontana steel mill in California, 5 months ahead of schedule, to supply his shipyards. Producing 700,000 tons of steel annually, Fontana made California a steel-producing state for the first time. Its furnaces glowed day and night, painting the desert sky with a copper light that could be seen for miles. The ripple effects reached everywhere. Kaiser's industrial empire expanded into magnesium and aluminum production for bombs and aircraft. His factories were linked like arteries, pulsing with war-driven urgency. Cities rose almost overnight. Richmond, California, swelled from 23,000 people in 1940 to over 100,000 by 1943, a human tide drawn by the promise of work. In Oregon, Kaiser built Vanport City to house shipyard workers. Within months, it became the state's second largest city, a living monument to the speed of wartime transformation. These boom towns glowed for only a brief time, but in their glow, one could glimpse the pulse of an America reinventing itself. And amid the heat and smoke, another quiet revolution began, one not of steel, but of care. To sustain his massive workforce, Kaiser turned to Dr. Sidney Garfield, creating a prepaid medical system to protect the health of his employees. That system, humble and local at first, would evolve into Kaiser Permanente, one of the largest healthcare networks in the world. It was born from necessity, but its spirit was visionary, affordable, preventive care available to all. Long after the sparks stopped flying in Richmond, that idea continued to heal millions. The war ended, but the lessons endured. Those who worked in Kaiser's shipyards carried their training and confidence into peacetime industries. Women who had learned to weld returned home with new ambitions. Men who had never operated heavy machinery found themselves skilled tradesmen, engineers, and foremen. Minorities who had earned respect in the shipyards brought those hard-won gains into communities that had long denied them opportunity. The techniques themselves, welding, prefabrication, modular construction, became the backbone of post-war industrial America. Bridges, refineries, skyscrapers, all bore the fingerprints of Liberty's legacy. The logic of the assembly line, married to the art of heavy industry, revolutionized not just what was made, but how it was imagined. In classrooms, too, the lessons took root. Harvard professor Michael Porter would later call the Liberty Ship program a masterclass in accelerated capability development. In his 1985 study on American competitiveness, he noted that Kaiser had proven something vital. Industrial capacity is not a fixed asset. It's a creation of organization and will. The United States had entered the war with almost no modern merchant shipbuilding capacity. Within 2 years, it was producing more tonnage than the rest of the world combined. That revelation, that speed, skill, and infrastructure could all be built almost from nothing, reshaped how nations thought about power. It was proof that impossible often meant unattempted. Even more important than the ships themselves was the transformation they created in the minds of engineers and managers. Before Kaiser, industry accepted limits as laws of nature. Production could only move so fast. Workers could only learn so much. Systems could only scale so far. Kaiser shattered those assumptions. He proved that innovation was not just about machinery. It was about imagination. The Liberty ship's story, when all the numbers and tonnage are stripped away, is really about belief. Ordinary men and women, given the right tools and training, built extraordinary things. Complex systems that once took years could be mastered in weeks. Industries that had resisted change for centuries could evolve almost overnight. The miracle wasn't in the steel, it was in the human spirit that shaped it. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, understood this better than anyone. In his 1960 memoir, he wrote, "We fought across 5,000 miles of Pacific Ocean, supplied by ships built faster than the enemy could sink them. Japan believed America's industrial capacity had limits. They were wrong. They failed to account for Henry Kaiser." By 1944, the U.S. was replacing lost ships faster than the Axis could destroy them. The math of war had flipped. 3 built for every 2 lost. Industrial capacity, Nimitz reflected, not martial valor, determined the outcome. The truth was simple and sobering. The Pacific War was won as much in Richmond and Portland as it was on the beaches of Iwo Jima or the cliffs of Okinawa. When the guns fell silent in 1945, Kaiser's greatest triumph wasn't the 1,590 ships his yards produced. It was the redefinition of what humanity could achieve under pressure. The Robert E. Peary, built in less than 5 days, became more than a record. It was a symbol carved into steel that tradition was not truth, and that innovation begins where certainty ends. Those who once mocked Kaiser's ambition later sent delegations to study his methods. Shipbuilders who had dismissed him as a reckless outsider adopted his modular approach. His young welders and fitters carried their wartime skills into peacetime industries, fueling the post-war boom that rebuilt America. The practices born in urgency became standards of efficiency around the globe. It's easy now to see those black and white photos, the cranes, the sparks, the smiling faces, and forget the scale of what they did. But in the quiet between shifts, as the wind swept across the empty docks of Richmond, one could almost hear the echo of what they proved. That courage isn't always found on battlefields. Sometimes it lives in the hands of people who simply refuse to believe that good enough can't be done faster, better, and together. Most of the Liberty ships are gone now, scrapped, sunk, or forgotten beneath layers of rust and time. Yet their legacy endures. It lives in every prefabricated bridge, every industrial plant built from modular sections, every assembly line that trains workers in days rather than years. And it lingers in every mind that dares to ask whether the impossible is truly impossible or just waiting for someone bold enough to try. Henry Kaiser's legacy isn't just measured in steel tonnage or ships afloat. It's written in the way we think about work, innovation, and human potential. From that first contract signed in December 1940 to the Robert E. Peary's breathtaking 5-day berth in 1942 to the final Liberty ship launched in September 1945, one lesson rang clear across time and ocean. Progress doesn't belong to tradition. It belongs to those who dare to question it. The last sparks of Richmond's furnaces may have faded long ago, but in the faint hum of every factory, in the quiet clang of a shipyard at dusk, you can still almost hear it. The echo of steel meeting steel, and the steady heartbeat of people who refuse to accept that impossible was the final word.